O Museu Judaico está realizando um festival de literatura, trouxe 5 autores estrangeiros para falarem de literatura judaica. O mais festejado deles é David Baddiel, que escreveu um livro surpreendente, que em inglês se chama Jews Don't Count, e que acaba de ser traduzido, Judeus Não Contam. Como ele é escritor, comediante e 10 outras coisas, eu achei que seria uma conversa muito interessante para a gente ter. David, thank you for giving us a few minutes of your time.
My pleasure.
So we can talk about the ideas behind this book.
Okay.
First of all, I mean, you probably heard it 100 times. Why did you write this book?
Well, I wrote this book because for a while, really quite a long time, I've been noticing something specific about the way that people thought, not just about Jews, but about minorities in general. This was in the UK, but I felt that it was more or less global, that in the last sort of 20 years, there'd been a very deep intensification of the way that people were concerned about minorities. So what we now call, I guess, identity politics, but really the way that progressive people in particular had established a narrative whereby we care a lot about racism and discrimination, about inclusion, about representation, about all those things. And what I noticed was that Jews were not included in that concern. That wasn't a big deal for anyone who was talking about that. I mean, I would say over the last 20 years, in a good way, there's been a massive correction in the way that people have thought about minorities, except Jews. And this accepting of Jews, this missing out of Jews from that conversation is what made me want to write the book.
Why? Why are Jews forgotten in the conversation?
Okay, so the book, it begins with about 12 different examples of what I'm talking about. Yes. And these range from sort of high literary examples. So, for example, I remember listening to BBC, and they had decided to begin New Year's Day, it was only a couple of years ago, with the reading of all of T.S. Eliot's poetry. And so if you read all of T.S. Eliot's poetry, you'll read a poem that says, "The rats are underneath the piles, the Jews are underneath the lot." And this is not something that you would even be allowed for any other minority for the BBC. You just would never have such a negative stereotype. So it goes from that to anti-Semitism at football matches, not being policed, etc., etc. It's about to, and then so it covers a wide range of ground, but at heart it comes down to, it comes down to a few things, but the most basic thing is that the reason that Jews are left out of that conversation is that most minorities are thought of as vulnerable, as oppressed, as poor, as non-white, and Jews are thought of as the opposite. Jews are thought of as powerful and rich and privileged and white. And that disqualifies them in the minds of some progressives from allyship, from going out and supporting and marching and trying to help Jews, because it's considered that Jews are not powerless. If anything, they're considered to be the powerful. And what's wrong with that is that Jewish history is an endless loop of disempowerment.
I get very upset with the idea that we're being punished for not crying all the time and trying to move on whatever the difficulties we have.
Right.
I mean, could it be related historically to something else?
Well, I think it's fairly constant in history that the vulnerability of Jews, the fact that Jews do get persecuted, is something that is not really remembered as much as you would expect. I would say that if you look at the way that Jews are imagined all the time, and going back a long way, as high status. This is unique amongst the way that people think about minorities. Most minorities are thought of as low status, as sort of animalistic and, thieving and poor and all the rest of it. And Jews get that, but they also get this sense of being in control of the world, in control of money. And that goes back to, in Britain, Jews were blood libeled in the 12th century because aristocrats thought that they had too much control of money. This is even in the 12th century, and they didn't want to repay debts to Jews, And so they created the blood libel in order to have people massacre Jews. And that's already, even then, an idea of Jews having too much power.
You wrote this book 2 years ago, more or less.
Yeah, I think it came out 2 years ago. I started writing it 3 years ago, but it came out.
Kind of like you were guessing that something terrible like the war in the Middle East right now would happen. Is there something that happened in the last few years? Did you see a crescendo in the anti-Semitism and that took you to write the book?
Not when I wrote, well, when I wrote it in Britain, there was a lot of talk at the time, just at the end of the time, about the British Labour Party, the British left, who were having their own anti-Semitism crisis. So there was suddenly this strange thing in Britain where Jews, who are a tiny minority in Britain, really a small minority, they're suddenly in the newspapers, anti-Semitism in the newspapers, and the whole of the left in Britain is arguing about whether or not the leader of the Labour Party is an anti-Semite. And so I felt there was a lot of confusion about the left and anti-Semitism, and that was partly why I wrote the book then. Now, I think we're in a situation where a lot of the things that I'm talking about, it's not that they've come true exactly, but that a lot of people write to me now and say the only thing that seems to make sense of the present moment is what you've written about, particularly in terms of the reaction. It's not so much what's happening in the Middle East.
Yes.
It's the reaction from mainly left-wing people in the West, the erasure of the idea that there is Jewish pain, there is violence against Jews, there is any sense in which Jewish concern about what's happening needs to be in the mix. That's the whole point I'm saying. Jews are not, the reality of Jews is not in the conversation. No one is talking about how Jews feel at the present moment.
Not at all. Would you say that we didn't promote, I'm not sure promote is the right verb here, but would you say that we didn't defend our cause or our group of people in the right way? We always thought it's not important, we don't care what you say.
No, I don't know if that's true. Well, so it's a good question. In Britain, I don't know about in Brazil, in Britain, Jews for a long time, the only place I think this is not true, I think it is true in Brazil, but it's not true only maybe in parts of New York and Israel, Jews tend to keep their heads down. Jews tend to say, we don't want to cause trouble. If there is anti-Semitism, we'd rather not talk about it. Let's just leave it and it'll go away.
Yes.
That's what Jews tend to do. And this book is not like that. This book is very militant about Jews should speak about anti-Semitism.
Interesting that you say the book is militant, because somewhere here it's clear that you don't want to make a point, you don't want to win the argument. You just want to bring the argument to the table.
That's true. That's true. Well, there is not an argument to be won, I don't think, although some people might think there is, but I think it's more about saying, I'm trying to deconstruct a mindset. Here is the anti-Semitic mindset. It's changed, or at least it's got a new version in recent years, and I particularly am looking at, which perhaps we should have said earlier, a type of anti-Semitism that comes from an unexpected place. Because I think people think anti-Semitism comes mainly from the right, and it does. From the far right, it still does. But I'm talking really about people who imagine themselves as being very, very anti-racist, very anti-discrimination, and yet they still have this blind spot about Jews, right? And so what I'm really doing is just deconstructing that mindset. Why is it like that? And then laying it out. I'm not really saying what should happen. I just hope that something will happen, but I don't explain what will happen.
I read a few days ago some kind of an article that said all what's happening today has to do with the generation of the Vietnam War that became teachers, and those teachers were radical leftists. They formed a new generation of teachers, and there is only one way to looking at things, and always the word colonialism comes in, no matter if it's not true, but we're blamed for things that we don't even know how to address. Somebody was interviewing terrorist leader at Sky News in Australia, and the lady starts the interview saying, what would you say, how long will this ceasefire take? And the gentleman starts answering, it's not a ceasefire. So the conversation becomes almost impossible because whatever seems to be a fact, suddenly it's not.
Okay, so can I just go back to the
Yes.
first thing you said?
Yes.
So I don't know, it's an interesting idea about beginning with the activism against Vietnam. That might be true. But my book is very much influenced, I think, by social media. Because I think social media has created a particular narrative of looking at the world. Remember, social media is a performative space, right? It allows people to go on stage almost and say, this is who I am. And that
Yes.
turbocharges how people want to be seen. And how they want to be seen, in my documentary, I made a documentary about this. Yes. Jonathan Safran Foer, who's a writer, said it makes people think about the world just in terms of the victimizers and the victimized. And people always want, particularly on social media, to be on the side of the victimized, right? And Jews are somehow never the victimized, they're always the victimizers. Now, the problem with the whole thing is that binary, because the world is not binary.
No.
The world is complicated, and good and evil, particularly, are very rarely a binary. And if anything, Jews are a massive glitch in the matrix of that binary.
Okay. We're 100,000 Jews here in Brazil.
Yeah.
And like 60, 70,000 live in São Paulo.
Yeah, and they're all coming tonight. It's amazing.
I'd like you to leave a message to our viewers who are Jews and non-Jews.
Okay. So you just want a big Christmas message, basically.
If it's a Christmas message, we'll take it.
Okay. Okay, so to the Jews, what I would say is it's quite, you can read my book and what I say and maybe get quite depressed. And so I do. I'm quite a depressive person. And so I sometimes think I'm basically describing a mindset that is quite embedded and also seems to be getting worse. Okay. But there's one thing, and actually I'm going to mention another book I wrote. I wrote another book called The God Desire, which is about being a Jewish atheist, which is what I am. Mm-hmm. And in that I talk about one of the things I deeply love about Jews is Jewish survival, is despite what I'm talking about, which is years and years and years of persecution and a new type of persecution now, Jews somehow managed to survive. So I'm going to say to the Jews watching, even though you might think this is a bad time, we tend to survive. So we're good at survival. And what I would say to the non-Jews is, well, the non-Jews who are not anti-Semites, you should be pleased about that, because Jews in general bring culture and life and humour and comedy to the world. So Jews are generally a good thing. And to the anti-Semites, I will say, can I say fuck off or not? Not on this channel.
You already said it.
Okay.
Okay, David, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was a pleasure.
A pleasure to talk to you as well.
O Mosaico volta já já.